Hey, this is Matthew from the future. Obviously, not your future, but the future from this episode, otherwise known as Editor Matt. And as I was editing this episode, I realized that there's something I need to let you know before you watch or listen to this episode. I'm actually going to make it two things. The first is that I am so excited for this podcast guest. Dr. Beentjes is a fantastic scholar of the Book of Ben Sira. And I'm so glad that we got to interview him. At the time of recording, he is 78 years old, and he has given so much of his life to helping people understand this book better. But it is a travesty that he isn't anywhere on YouTube or podcast platforms. One of the reasons why I started my podcast was to connect great scholars to more people. And he is a prime example of that. Very thankful. And he's joining us all the way from the other side of the world and doing this interview in English, which is not his native language. So grateful for this opportunity. The thing I wanted to let you know is we found out about 12 minutes of the way through, there was some kind of noise that was being made. We found out that it was his headphones kind of rubbing against his jacket. So for about the first 12 minutes or so, you'll notice that there's a sound that you'll hear. And if it's so bothersome, I'm going to let you know exactly in the description below where you can skip ahead to. Hopefully, it's not too bothersome because every minute of this podcast was really a gift, a really special. Loved getting to hear from him. So, again, if that sound is bothersome to you, it does end after about the 12-minute mark. There's a link in the description below exactly where that noise stops. So without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. Welcome to Hebrew Bible Insights, a podcast about making sense of the Hebrew Bible. I'm Matthew Delaney, here with Dr. Nathan French. And today we have a special guest all the way from the other side of the world. Today we have Dr. Panc Beentjes, and he is a world-renowned Ben Sira scholar. One of our most popular podcast episodes was about Ben Sira. It's still such an important book that gives us so much information about an important time period. And it's also one of our most well-attested examples of the Hebrew language outside of what's called the typical Hebrew Bible. And we're really excited that we were able to have this phenomenal scholar who he has written probably about 200 or so different works on Ben Sira during his career. And he's Emeritus Professor at Tilburg School of Catholic Theology. And he's had a long, amazing career of scholarship, and we're so excited to have him with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm blushing.
So the first question I wanted to ask is, I'm just curious, how did you first get interested in Ben Sira, and what has made this book such a passion for you to dedicate a life of scholarship to it?
Yeah, there are at least two elements for my interest in Ben Sira. The first one is a rather practical one. I was looking for a dissertation subject, and it was in the mid-70s. The deuterocanonical literature was not so en vogue those days. Mm-hmm. So it was on the periphery of scholarly interest. So it was easy for me to choose a subject in deuterocanonical literature. And it was Ben Sira. And why Ben Sira? That's the second reason. Personally, I was, how do you say it, stuck by von Raat, his book Wijsheid in Israel, Wisdom in Israel, was for me an enormous incentive to study the Book of Ben Sira, because as a Catholic Roman Catholic student, he, as a Protestant, was so involved with the wisdom literature, especially with Ben Sira, that it came from heaven that his book was published, and that I has chosen Ben Sira as a subject to study further on. And I never regretted that I have chosen, thanks to von Raat, the Book of Ben Sira.
That's great.
It is a very important book still after 30, 40, 50 years. I would recommend it to everyone to have a look at Von Raad's Wisdom in Israel. It is translated into English, of course. Such famous books are always translated into English. I would recommend it to everyone.
Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah, I always tell my students, you can't be in this field without dealing with Von Raad, right? I mean,
yes,
you have to deal with Von Raad at some point, being in Hebrew Bible of any sort. So that's great.
Yeah.
So for those who are not familiar with Ben Sira, could you give maybe a brief overview of the book and the person and why this book is important? So that would be great.
You can say Ben Sira was a teacher and a pedagogue in early 2nd century BCE. His book focused on young students who are addressed to as my son, to be instructed on how to live as a good person, as a pious Jew, as a good member of the society. The main theme of the book is to live in fear of God. But to fear or in love of God does not mean to be anxious of God or be terrified by God, but to believe in God. To fear of Adonai is to believe in God. In other words, have a healthy respect of God according to God's commandments, to live according to God's commandments. In this way of life is, among others, presented in a metaphor, which we'll discuss later on, to follow as a friend or a follower, Lady Wisdom. Wisdom, which is, of course, another important aspect of the Book of Ben Sira, is personified as a lady who came from heaven and settled in Israel in a tent and so on. It is which enables such students to follow Lady Wisdom, to be a friend of her. That's one. Another section of the book is the praise of the fathers. That's chapters 44 till 50. It's a demonstration, in my view, of how important persons of Israel's history serve as an example of such a life in fear of God. Abraham, Moses, and so on. The good kings of Israel. All the continuing topic is fear of Adonai, fear of God. And that's the main point of the book. That would be two items I like to stress as main features of the Book of Ben Sira.
Very good.
Yes.
Yeah, that's excellent. It definitely is unique to have a what's typically called wisdom literature book that actually goes into the history of Israel. And so to see some of the history of Israel discussed from the perspective of a sage is very unique. So those are some of the distinctives of Ben Sira. Do you have any just personal favorite sections of Ben Sira? It's a very long book for those who haven't read it. There's plenty of material.
Yeah.
Are there any certain sections you enjoy the most?
Just as the book of Jeremiah, it has 51 chapters, and that's the longest of all biblical books. So it's quite a lot of work to go through it and made some comments on it. But there are, in fact, three main streams in the book that I would like to introduce. The first is the praise of Lady Wisdom in chapter 24. Because it's so characteristic of the Book of Ben Sira. On the one hand, it reminds of Proverbs chapter 8, verses 22-36, where wisdom is presented as a kid playing after being from heaven gone on earth. And on the other hand, it reminds of an Egyptian goddess, Isis,
Yeah.
who was enormously popular in the Mediterranean area. You can see it in the text of Ben Sira chapter 24. Some verses of that chapter are almost literal quotations from the so-called Isis Aretalogia, a list of virtues of goddess Isis. It looks as if Ben Sira tried to make the Jewish Lady Wisdom popular using the images and the virtues, the list of virtues of the goddess Isis. And I think during the book of Ben Sira, this way of writing, on the one hand, the Jewish tradition, on the other hand, Mediterranean traditions or Hellenistic traditions, makes that he try to prove that Israel tradition already had all those things that were so popular in the Hellenistic time. And if you look at the book with this specific eyes, you will find a lot of examples that the Jewish tradition has already had already those things from which were popular in the Hellenistic time. You can also see it in the Book of Wisdom. Solomon is described in the same way as Hellenistic king, but with stresses that the Jewish tradition had already all those things that in the Book of Wisdom were attributed to Hellenistic kings. And the Book of Wisdom is some later than Ben Sira, but it must be an item in those areas, in those centuries. That the Jewish tradition is not far away from Hellenistic tradition on the one hand, but it is also our own tradition as a Jew. That's important, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. No,
that's one example of the second example is a prayer in chapter 36, which I will read later on in the interview. And the third important part of the book is already mentioned. That's the praise of the fathers. Example, right. how existing narratives about biblical figures are used to present a specific message to live in fear of God. Chapter 24, chapter 36, chapters 44 to 50. If you read these chapters carefully, you will have a very good indication of the Book of Ben Sira, in my opinion.
All right, that was excellent. So I want to turn to Ben Sira's grandson here. Okay, so can you discuss the uniqueness of the introduction of Ben Sira's grandson? What are some of the insights we can learn from this? And this as well. How similar or different are their views on Torah and wisdom? Very interesting.
Yes. The prologue of the grandson is a fine example of problems a translator must face and overcome. For me, the most important aspect of the prologue would be that the grandson states that the Hebrew text of his grandfather and his own Greek translation are two separate entities. For me, it means that the both texts should be studied on their own.
Fascinating.
And should not be mixed up to get one text that in fact doesn't exist, which you see in the commentaries often and often again. May I read some lines of the prologue in which he states this problem?
Please.
Yeah.
You are invited, therefore, to read it, the prologue, with goodwill and attention, and to be indulgent in cases where, despite our diligent labor in translating, we may seem to have rendered some phrases imperfectly. For what was originally expressed in Hebrew does not have exactly the same sense when translated into another language. Not only this book, but even the law itself, the prophecies, and the rest of the books differ not a little when read in the original. And in fact, this is the problem of all translators, all the times, all the centuries, that you can't say this is the original and the translation is the same as the original.
Yeah.
And I struggled many times with publishers to make a commentary in which both the Hebrew text was commented upon and the Greek text in 2 pages. But it is too expensive for a publisher to make such a book. That's in fact the reason.
Wow.
And then you see that in most commentaries the canonical Greek text is used, and sometimes the Hebrew is put into, or otherwise the Hebrew is leading, and then the Greek is put into, because there is not a complete Hebrew text. But we will see in the due course that some examples that there is quite a difference between the Hebrew text of the grandfather and the Greek translation of his grandson. And we have to respect it and not to mingle it, for then we do not know who wrote the text.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
No, it really is. And I mean, I probably shouldn't go there with it, but sort of on a macro level, it's kind of like this, right? Like Hebrew, Greek, grandson, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it kind of has that feel within Judaism itself, but very interesting. So,
yeah.
Yeah, that's excellent nuance. And anyone getting into Ben Sira scholarship, I think that the introduction by his grandson, it's so unique that we get that great insight into it, but realizing we have to approach the Greek and Hebrew very differently. You know, another question.
There are only a few examples, texts in antiquity describing this problem. And this is one of the few. And therefore it is very important that the translator realizes what he or she is doing.
Right.
Yep.
So
excellent.
Good.
Another question that we have about the introduction is the introduction of Ben Sira is particularly famous for an early reference to a Hebrew Bible canon. What do you think we can infer from this about the canon discussion?
Yeah. Quite recently, Alma Brodersen, you will remember that name, that will be, okay, I will send you the book, published an excellent study called The Beginning of the Biblical Canon and Ben Sira, 2022. Which is, in my opinion, no less than a painstaking deconstruction of the widespread view of the passages that are commonly referred to as proof of the biblical canon already in the time of the grandson and so on. And she says her conclusion is that in the time of the grandson, we speak about 130 before BCE, there was no fixed canon as we have now, just some parts of it. And maybe, and that's my point, maybe that's one of the reasons why Ben Sira hardly quotes from any of the three parts of the Hebrew Bible. Because the text wasn't established yet.
Yeah.
Many times one said yes, but the Torah was established 400 BCE. But it's a very important book. I wrote a review on it, and I'm very impressed what she is saying about all those theories about that Ben Sira's grandson already had a tripartite canon in front of him, which is not, I think. I will send you the cover of the book.
That'd be great.
I think it will be rouse a storm, so to say.
Significant book, yeah.
Well, thank you for that recommendation. It's definitely, I think too often people avoid the Book of Ben Sira, but one of the more common reasons that some people do get into Ben Sira is because of that reference. It is brought up for people who care about the canon discussion. And thank you for the recommendation for people who want to learn more. But most of our conversation, we just want to appreciate Ben Sira for his own work, right? And get to enjoy what he has to say. And what I want to do is introduce people to a book that you did, the Book of Ben Sira in Hebrew. Very simple title, but a very revolutionary book that you wrote. I'm not going to ask you how long ago it's been now, but this is a book that you wrote, which was the first. This is the first time that anyone presented the different Hebrew manuscripts of Ben Sira in the best way possible on a book like what we can have, right? That actually presents the official layout. There had been other people in the past, who had tried to present the text in some ways or another. But anyway, your book is very unique. It was very, very important for scholarship. And I wonder if you can talk just a little bit about, before we get into the details of your work, can you tell us what's the story behind the discovery and the importance of the Hebrew manuscripts of Ben Sira?
Yeah. The manuscripts were discovered from 1896 onwards. The first discovery was in the Geniza of the Ibn Ezra synagogue in Cairo. The roof, above the roof, were all manuscripts that were not complete and so on, were stored because in the Jewish tradition, holy manuscripts were not burned or thrown away, but were kept. Many times were buried, but here they were stored above the roof in the synagogue in Cairo. And the discovery was world news. It appeared that the manuscripts were medieval, 10th, 11th century. And the last mention of the Hebrew manuscript was from 800 AD. For example, Saint Jerome have had Ben Sira in his hands in Hebrew, but didn't translate it because it was not canonical in his eyes. But that's one of the reasons why the book has survived in Greek.
Right.
The Hebrew text was not canonical, although in rabbinic literature there are more than 100 quotations by rabbis from the Book of Ben Sira. So it's a very peculiar book, even in Jewish tradition. Okay, that's one.
Yeah. Yeah.
In 1964, Yigal Yadin did a very important discovery at Masada. That's a rock in the Judean desert. He discovered a Ben Sira scroll. Masada was conquered by the Romans in 72 or 73 AD, which means that Ben Sira scroll must be earlier than 72 AD, because it was found there. And some years afterwards, in the caves of Qumran, in the Judean deserts, psalm scroll was found, in which a part of Ben Sira chapter 51 appeared to be written down. And these two discoveries, the scroll of Masada and the psalm scroll of Qumran, was solid proof that the medieval manuscripts were good.
Yeah.
After the discovery in 1896, there was always discussion whether or not the Hebrew manuscripts were retranslated from the Greek or from another language. And now on, you could see that the text of Masada and the Psalm scroll were quite similar to the medieval manuscripts from the 10th and 11th century. And that was an important point in history, because from then on, scholars were not driven to prove that the medieval manuscripts were genuine. For Masada and the Qumran scroll were evidence that they were pieces, reliable, and so on. And from then on, you can see that from 1964 onwards, there was a turn in Ben Sira research. No more text critical questions in the first place, but theology and so on. And then fear of the Lord, for instance, became a dissertation. And now you can look at my library, and then all theological questions now came on the forefront, and therefore it is very important.
Love it. That's fascinating. What a fascinating story of scholarship with regard to Ben Sira and all the discoveries that have been made, especially even within fairly recent time period. I think it was Martin Luther. He followed Saint Jerome, I think, right, and left it in the Apocrypha for that reason. But this is great to see. Second Temple Jews living in the land, Masada, what we have in Qumran, we see that tradition is different than. I mean, they're using it. So very fascinating to see that. That sort of leads us even into this next question, because it really focuses then on, so what is really the difference between Hebrew Ben Sira and the previously attested manuscripts of Ben Sira, obviously coming from the Alexandrian tradition with the Greek and the Syriac being different as well. So tell us a little bit about that.
I think we must see three different questions. First, historical circumstances. Ben Sira published his book in about 190, 180 BCE. His grandson translated the Greek about 130, 120 BCE. And halfway these two dates, 190 and 130, the campaign of Antiochus Epiphanes IV, the Syriac, took place. And I think this event influenced the Greek translation of the grandson. Dus the Hebrew text is before this attack by the Syrians, so to say. The grandsons is after the attack by the Syriacs. So we have to study those two texts in their own right, as I mentioned before. And second, there might be differences between the Greek and the Hebrew because of cultural differences.
Yeah.
Ben Sira's document, the Hebrew, originated in, let us say, an agricultural and Jewish society, whereas the grandson's translation was realized in an urban Hellenistic society, namely in Egypt. And I have one small example that you can see it, the agricultural and the urban circumstances. In Ben Sira 3:9 might serve as a good illustration. In the Hebrew, it is said, and I quote, "The blessing of a father gives a firm root, but the curse of a mother uproots the plant." In the Greek, a father's blessing strengthens the houses of the children, but a mother's curse uproots their foundations.
Fascinating. Yeah.
So cool.
In the Hebrew, you see agricultural, roots and plants.
Right.
In the Greek, you see the foundations of the house and the fortification of the house. And this is a similar example that you can't say it is the same text. No, the grandson has translated it not only from the Hebrew into the Greek, but also from, let us say, from Palestine into Egypt.
Wow.
And so are many examples to see. And a third point to stress is from time to time there are marked theological differences between the Hebrew and the Greek. And I have one example, chapter 50, verse 22, at the end of the book, almost. "And now, bless Adonai, the God of Israel, who wondrously works on earth." The God of Israel who works on earth. And the Greek is, "And now, bless the God of all, who everywhere works great wonders." Dus the God of Israel has become the God of all, or the God of the universe, or how you make that. And also a theological, the God of Israel is now the God of all, or the God of the universe. And so you can always discover some small examples of how the theology of the grandson differs from the grandfather because of cultural, historical, societal, and so on differences.
It's brilliant.
Yes. About one about the Syriac is also interesting.
Yeah.
The Syriac dates about the 4th century AD. It's made from the Hebrew, but the translators had access to the Greek text. And the Syriac translators got its final form by Orthodox Christians. So the Syriac translation is made by Orthodox Christians. Because I have here 12 examples of how the New Testament text, how New Testament text has been introduced into the Syriac translation. With examples of 1 Timothy, John, Luke, and so on. Reading the Syriac translation, you can see it must have been, in any case, in the last edition, by Christian translators.
Wow.
And therefore, I'm not a fan of putting the Syriac translation just up the Hebrew translation, the Hebrew text, because there are so many people between it.
Yeah.
There's every text, and that's my repetition. Every text has to be studied on its own.
Wow.
Wow,
Yes.
this is excellent. These examples are fantastic. They really help us see the differences on the molecular level.
Yeah.
I love that the difference between the agricultural Israel context versus it's almost like an urban versus rural context, and you can just see it on the page there.
It also shows something Matti and I say a lot, and we like to tell our students this, that every act of translation, there is interpretation happening, isn't there? And that is obvious in this case, that you see the different interpretive moves that are being made in the translations. So it's great.
Yeah, and I think this also shows the importance that translation is not just a matter of language. Let me look at one word. How do I understand this word in another language? Or if I want to edit something, I'll edit it, but realizing the culture and the history are just as important.
Yeah.
Because if someone didn't understand the cultural difference of Israel to Egypt, they wouldn't understand why are we uprooting a plant versus uprooting the foundation of a house? But as you explained, knowing the very rural versus urban context, it actually makes a lot of sense. So yeah, this is a great plug for, again, when we read text, let's look at the complete ancient historical, cultural, linguistic context. That's excellent. So I wonder if we can start to dive into more of your book and focusing on the Hebrew manuscripts of this. What are the major manuscripts for Hebrew Ben Sira? How are they similar and different from one another? And maybe also kind of say, why are they so unique that it was important for you to do this work that you published?
Yes. I first will mention the importance of manuscript B. Not only because of its size, it is the greatest, the biggest manuscript of 21 folios or leaves, but also because of the beautiful presentation. It is presented in columns. As I said before, the Masada scroll is very important because of its age, as it proves the reliability of the Hebrew text. And manuscript C, ABC, because it is quite an odd manuscript, as it is an anthology. It's not a text that continues, but it has some themes that has been put together in a manuscript. Bijvoorbeeld, for example, shame, which in the Mediterranean world was a very important item.
Right.
All verses, all passages about shame have been put together in manuscript C. Quite recently, in fact in 27, new perspectives were visible after the discovery of a new leaf, D, by Eliezer Shulamat. But I'm not a text critical expert, so I refer to a publication by my colleague Jean-Sébastien Rey from the Lorraine University in Nancy, Metz in France. He has studied it quite intensively, and we have a photo of it. He discovered the interrelation between the manuscripts. He proves that manuscript A, manuscript D, and the marginal notes in manuscript B are from the same family, so to say, whereas manuscript B is from a different order. But reading manuscript B, you can see that there are marginal notes in manuscript B, which means that someone who knew another manuscript, reading manuscript B, have written all differences between what he had in front of him and what was written in manuscript B. It's very interesting.
Yeah,
and,
that is.
And there are even Persian glosses, Persian marginal notes in manuscript B. Maybe the one who wrote those notes in manuscript B read manuscript B in Persia. But it's we don't know. There's no name on it. But it's very interesting to see how manuscript B is on its own, and manuscript A, D, and the marginal notes are from the same family.
Yeah.
And all this came to our knowledge because of the discovery of wine one leaf in 2007.
Wow.
It's amazing.
But I'm not an expert on proving that things are so. Maar goed. Now about my text edition, want you asked about my text edition. I decided to make a text edition because till then there was no book in which you could find the different manuscripts. How do you say it? One to each other.
Yeah.
Successive to each other. Yeah. Something.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, text editions before 2000 printed the Hebrew text colummetrically, just as in manuscript B. But manuscript B is the only manuscript, and Masada scroll too, where the text has been written in 2 columns. And manuscript A, C, D, E, and F is continuous. But I had to find a system to indicate that. Therefore, you find in my text edition slash where the end of the page. You have to find it, but that's the only way I could do it, because I had to print it as a continuing text. And slash is where the end of the verse is. And a synopsis. There was no synopsis of all those manuscripts. It was very hard to compare one another, because in the text editions you had one text chosen as the main text, and then with all footnotes indicate the differences with another manuscript or manuscripts. And therefore you had no idea of how those other manuscripts looked, because you had only some words in a footnote and so on. And therefore I made a synopsis of all those manuscripts.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I'm so thankful that you did this work. I imagine it was a lot of work between you as well as the publisher, because this book is one of the most unique books you'll ever open, right? Like, you don't just read it only, left to right. You'll flip up your book, and we'll show some images a little bit later for those on YouTube.
But the publisher had only to print it. Well, it was a camera ready. The camera ready text to the
excellent. Yeah, you did all the work.
Never do it. Awful. Yeah.
That's great.
It's great. Yeah. It's amazing having a Hebrew text where we can actually see the special marginal notes and the intentionality of the columns. And I think this is important, because when we want to represent manuscripts, we should do it as the manuscript is laid out itself. And not to get into a rabbit hole here, but it's interesting even how Biblia Hebraica over the decades has made different changes to what the manuscript is, whether changing the column format, because famously you have
Yes.
the 2 versus 3 column formats
Right.
of some of the different books.
Habakkuk, for instance.
Right.
The Book of Habakkuk
the,
is, for instance, is in Kittel, otherwise printed than in Stuttgart.
Yeah.
Stuttgart edition. Yeah,
Wow.
and so on.
So anyway, I'm anyone who is like team all about let's make sure we present the manuscripts as they are to the best of our ability. I love it. So very thankful for your work. Okay, could you give one or a few interesting examples of the textual notes in Manuscript B and its connection to the Masada manuscript?
Yeah. A simple example is Ben Sira chapter 41 verse 1, where you can read Chaim Lamawet Ma, which is no Hebrew. You can't make their sense of it. But then you see in the margin Veho. And then you have O, death, Y, and so on.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that Ho Lamawet Ma is according to the scroll of Masada. So this is an early proof that the text of Masada is correct. The passage about death, Hoi Lamawet Ma.
Wow.
Masada is proof that manuscript B is not correct, but that the margin of manuscript B is correct. And that's very an important question. How Chaim became the standard text in B is a question. You can say Hoi and Chaim has some similarity, but the meme at the end is quite strange. So it always are puzzles why such a word as Chaim became the main text of manuscript B. But thanks to Masada, we know that it is not in order, but that it must be Hoi. And the second example would be 42, verse 2. Ben Sira 42, verse 2b says, Ve'al mejdik lahatzdik rasha, which is quite nonsensical. But Masada has Ve'al mishpat lahatzdik rasha. But you saw that. And then, be not ashamed of justice to justify the wicked. The B text has no sense by repeating mejdik, lazdik. And interestingly, the margin of manuscript B is similar to the Masada text. Dus instead of mejdik, has it mishpat. The origin of these problems, textual problems, is not quite sure. Is it because the text was dictated? But mejdik and mishpat is not that you mishear it. So we don't know how this kind of text originated, but thanks to Masada, we can see that the margin of B corrected the reading of manuscript B.
Fascinating. Yeah.
And the Greek in both texts is according to Masada. That is an additional proof that the Hebrew text must be as it was in the Masada scroll.
Wow.
That's also an important thing. Yeah.
Oh.
Okay. Two small examples. Sometimes it is quite complicated.
No.
But most of the time, the marginal readings of Manuscript B are earlier, are more original. Let me say original, not earlier, want ze hebben hem later inserted into the text, of course. But are original, more original than.
That's great. Excellent. That leads us to another question that we want to ask you as well. So I'm writing a paper on Job with a former student of mine, and I've been fascinated by the fact that Job has chosen to suffer because of his righteousness, and then through the whole ordeal, you get to the end where he has this vision, and he has to intercede for his friends, and it's that intercession piece that has really caught our attention, because we thought, well, this is like Abraham in Genesis 20, who is said by the Lord to Pharaoh to say that Abraham is a prophet and he'll intercede for you. And so we've really thought about this Job being a prophet. And Mati brought to my attention that Ben Sira might call Job a prophet. And so we want to ask you about this question. So there's this potential reading in Job and Ben Sira 49:9. Why would Ben Sira call Job a prophet, and what is the significance of this? And as a side note to this, it's very difficult for us to see this word in the manuscript that's available online at bensira.org. So we're going to have you show us the picture online and comment on this image, and talk to us about the letters of prophet in the Hebrew scroll, if it's visible or not.
Yes. The mention of Ezekiel in 49:8 is followed by a reference to Job, as you said. The question whether some traces of ink after Job in 49:9 point to the now Nabi will forever be unsolved, since there is a small hole in the paper. There are only minuscule traces of ink above and underneath that hole, and we don't know whether that will be to the word Navi. I like to add some comments on Job as a prophet. According to some rabbis, Job was considered a prophet. Josephus, Flavius Josephus, too listed Job among the prophets. So there is not far-fetched to
think that way.
To think that way. Second, the Greek translator has certainly misread the Hebrew text, confusing Job, with Oyev, enemy. But I think three remarks are in order here. I noted that because otherwise, the connection of Ezekiel and Job is not far-fetched, because in Ezekiel chapter 14, Job is mentioned, I quote, even if Noah, Daniel, and Job, these three were in the land, they would save only their own lives by their righteousness, says the Lord God. That's one. Two, in rabbinic literature, Bava Batra and Nida, Job throws out that God has confused his name, Iyov, with Oyev, enemy. In Bava Batra 16, God says, now, if I do not confuse one moment with another moment, would I confuse Iyov with Oyev? And in Nida chapter 52, God says, now, if I did not confuse one follicle with another, would I confuse a man named Iyov, Job with Iyov? So there is a tradition that Job were considered a prophet in the Jewish tradition. Flavius Josephus, some rabbis, and the discussion Job and Oyev is also a very old one, and the Greek translator, the grandson, didn't understand.
Wow.
A last reminder: in Islam, Surah 21 mentions Ayub, a prophet.
Yep. Yeah, I
So,
forgot about that. Right.
There must be an old tradition considering Job as a prophet.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, we have a hole in the manuscript.
right where Navi would be. Right.
to prove that it is an old tradition. But it's not.
That's
and
great.
I have not. You asked for me whether or not I had another photo to which would more specific about that hole, but there isn't.
Yeah,
it isn't.
Yeah, we can edit this part out if you want, but I'm just curious. I'm just gonna real quick go to this because, as you mentioned in here, where we have V'gam hiskir et Yov. And
yeah,
someone did that on purpose. No, I'm joking. So no,
but in the manuscript is always or it is not readable, or it is the other side on which text is written. It's I don't know what the English term is, but that the ink has come through the paper from the backside.
Yeah,
that might be a possibility.
I see.
Okay, interesting.
But this is too great a hole to make
know.
some.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, that definitely makes sense, because whenever I look at the text editions, or the digital editions, they tend to.
Do they put in a V in brackets? Don't they?
Yeah, they tend to.
Yeah.
Let me share my screen here just to show you this, where this is like on accordance. Where V'gam hiskir et Yov, and then
but
so they have the noon, right?
Yeah, but even those letters, there are points above, which means hardly readable.
That's right. Yeah.
But it's interesting. But there are some traditions that it might be
that already go there with it. Yeah. So interesting.
Okay.
Well, good.
That's great.
That helps us understand that piece then. So we appreciate that.
So I wonder if you could read a portion of Ben Sira in Hebrew and English, and maybe just share some insights from the text with our audience, just to give us a real great taste of Ben Sira.
Okay. 36. Hoshienu Elohei HaKol V'sim Chadcha al Kol Hagoyim Hanef al Am Nekar Vayir'u et Gevuratecha Ka'asher Nikdashta Le'enehem Banu Ken Le'enenu Hikavet Banu Vayedu Ka'asher Yadanu Ki En Elohim Zulatecha. And the English translation: save us, O God of all, and cast fear of you upon all the nations. Shake your hand against the strange people, that they may see your power, as you have sanctified yourself in us before their eyes, so sanctify yourself in them before our eyes. Thus they will know, as we know, that there is no God but you.
Wow.
Beautiful.
I can say why I have chosen this particular text, because my first planning on this dissertation was chapter 36, a prayer. And the plan was to study the quotations in that prayer, because it is full of quotations. But then I came to some insight. Where did Ben Sira quote Hebrew Bible as we know it now? And then I discovered some different categories in the way he used to refer to the, let us say, Hebrew Bible. One of the things I am proud of, so to say, is inverted quotations. Many times, Ben Sira inverted words or passages from the Hebrew Bible by putting the words in a different order. And in my thinking, it is a proof that he wanted to indicate that I didn't think it is not my own invention, but I used words or passages that I adopted from Jewish tradition.
Wow.
And then further on in my dissertation, I discovered that in Greek literature and in Latin literature and even in Dutch literature, inverted quotations are found more often than we think. And so my original plan to make a comment on chapter 36, the prayer, broadened to quotations in Ben Sira. And one of the texts where you can find most strange or most beautiful quotations and what Ben Sira did with it is on the chapter 45, where he describes the high priest Aaron. It's a beautiful text.
Wow.
And yes, that yeah, no.
Well, that's an excellent. In fact,
yeah.
go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
No, one more comment. In Ben Sira literature, quite often it is said that the prayer of chapter 36 must be an insertion from later date. I think that can't be true, because in chapter 35, from verse 21 onwards, that is the way onto the prayer in 36. So if you read 35:21 following, you must come to the prayer in 36. Otherwise, it would be nonsense, 35 and so on.
That's great.
But there is still discussion whether this chapter is a later insertion. But I think it will be always discussed.
Sure. Well, that's excellent.
Sure.
I'm really glad you brought up the inverted quotation. I almost added that into our question list for you, but again, we already had so many questions I couldn't ask them all. I really loved reading your article you wrote about inverted quotations, and I'll link it in our description for any listeners who want to read it.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, like you said, you found many examples in the Hebrew Bible where
in
this
Ben
is
Sira.
done.
Also in the Hebrew Bible.
Correct.
In Ezekiel, in Numbers, and so on. I think great. it is an old way of saying it is not my own text. I borrowed it for everybody. Had the original text in the head, of course, not on. And then there was a moment of and then realized it is a play on words and so on.
That's great.
That's great.
Yep.
Well, I love your attention to detail, both on Hebrew manuscripts as well as fine details of style. Truly a great scholar of Ben Sira, and we thank you for the work that you've done. So I guess I'll ask, are there any last thoughts that you want to share with the people who are listening or watching to this? We've had a great conversation with you. We appreciate your time. Is there anything else you'd want to say to anyone who's interested in Ben Sira?
You had a question beforehand. People who like to read more about Ben Sira. Is there
Mhm.
what literature? I must confess, not so much literature.
Yeah.
I would specifically recommend the book by John Collins, Jewish Wisdom in the Hellenistic Age,
Excellent. Okay.
from 1997. I think that would be one of the most further steps in studying wisdom literature, and especially Ben Sira.
Yeah. Good.
And of course, introductions in the commentaries would be helpful. But there is not an easy introduction to Ben Sira in my head. I think John Collins would be the most profitable book to study about.
Okay. Well, excellent.
That's great.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We've loved getting to meet you. You're a
Oh, it's
great
been so
scholar,
good.
very kind as well. And thank you for the legacy of the scholarship which you've created. And I
Yeah.
will put links in the description for our audience for the things that you've talked about today. And any people who especially love reading from the Hebrew, I can't recommend enough his book, the Book
Yeah.
of Ben Sira in Hebrew. It's the definitive edition for engaging the Hebrew
Yeah.
text of manuscripts. So thank you so much for joining us for this interview today.
I enjoyed seeing you and talking to you.
Yeah.
Have a
Yes.
good time,
Oh, absolutely.
and all the best with Hebrew Insights.
Yes. Thank
Thank
you.
you.